The Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror, was a period of political repression and persecution that took place in the Soviet Union from 1936 to 1938. It was orchestrated by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who used the purge as a means of consolidating his power and eliminating his political enemies. The purge was characterized by a series of show trials in which prominent Communist Party members, military leaders, and other individuals were accused of crimes against the state. The trials were often rigged, with confessions obtained through torture and other forms of coercion. Many of the accused were executed, while others were sent to forced labor camps or imprisoned. The purge had a devastating impact on Soviet society, with estimates of the number of people affected ranging from 600,000 to 1.5 million. The purge had a profound impact, leaving a legacy of fear, suspicion, and mistrust. It also had a significant impact on the Soviet Union's military and economic strength, as many of the purged individuals were military leaders or skilled professionals. The purge was part of a broader pattern of political repression and persecution in the Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership. This included the forced collectivization of agriculture, which led to mass starvation and the deaths of millions of people, and the establishment of a vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. The purge began to wind down in 1938 as Stalin shifted his focus to preparing the Soviet Union for war. The purges of the Red Army were particularly damaging, with the purging of experienced military leaders leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable to attack in the early years of World War II. The Great Purge remains a controversial and traumatic period in Soviet history. While some have argued that it was necessary to weed out traitors and enemies of the state, others see it as a brutal and unjustifiable attack on individual freedoms and human rights. The legacy of the purge continues to be felt in Russia and other former Soviet republics. The Gulag was a vast system of forced labor camps operated by the Soviet Union from the 1920s until the 1950s. It is estimated that over 18 million people passed through the Gulag system during this time, and that between 1.5 and 2 million people died as a result of the harsh conditions and brutal treatment they endured. The origins of the Gulag can be traced back to the early days of the Soviet Union, when the newly established communist government was faced with a variety of challenges, including economic instability and political opposition. To deal with these challenges, the government established a system of forced labor camps to imprison and punish those deemed to be enemies of the state. Over time, the Gulag system grew in size and scope, with new camps being established throughout the Soviet Union. Prisoners were forced to work in a variety of industries, including mining, forestry, and construction. They were often subjected to brutal working conditions, with long hours and minimal food and medical care. Prisoners in the Gulag were often subjected to physical and psychological abuse by their captors. They were routinely beaten, starved, and forced to endure extreme weather conditions. Many were also subjected to torture and interrogation in an effort to extract confessions or information about alleged crimes. Despite the harsh conditions, some prisoners in the Gulag were able to find moments of hope and humanity. They formed communities within the camps, sharing food, clothing, and other resources. They also organized cultural and educational activities, including theater productions, poetry readings, and language classes. The Gulag system began to decline in the 1950s as Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev began to implement reforms aimed at reducing political repression and improving the lives of Soviet citizens. Many of the camps were shut down, and the remaining prisoners were released. Today, the Gulag is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Soviet Union. The stories of the millions of people who passed through the system serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of protecting individual freedoms and human rights. While the Gulag may have ended, its legacy lives on, serving as a warning to future generations about the dangers of unchecked state power. The Nazino Tragedy is a harrowing true story that took place on Nazino Island, in the Tomsk Oblast region of Russia, in the summer of 1933. It is a dark chapter in the history of the Soviet Union and a stark reminder of the atrocities that can be committed when totalitarian regimes hold absolute power. The Soviet Union was in the midst of a massive social engineering project known as the collectivization of agriculture. The goal was to transform the agricultural sector from a patchwork of small, privately owned farms into a system of large, state-run collective farms. Millions of peasants were forcibly relocated from their homes and sent to work on these collective farms. As part of this project, the Soviet government also decided to relocate a group of 6,000 socially harmful elements to a remote island in the Tomsk region. These individuals were deemed to be criminals, political dissidents, and other undesirable elements of society. The journey to Nazino Island was long and grueling. The prisoners were crammed into train cars for days on end, with little food or water. When they finally arrived on the island, they were greeted by a bleak and inhospitable landscape. The conditions on Nazino Island were horrific. The prisoners were given minimal rations and had to fend for themselves. There were no buildings or shelters, and the prisoners were forced to sleep in the open air. Disease and malnutrition were rampant, and many of the prisoners died within days of arriving on the island. To make matters worse, the Soviet authorities had not provided any tools or equipment for the prisoners to build shelter or grow their own food. The prisoners were left to fend for themselves, scavenging for food and supplies wherever they could find them. As the weeks went on, the situation on Nazino Island deteriorated even further. Some of the prisoners resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The Soviet authorities did little to intervene, and in fact seemed to view the deaths of the prisoners as a form of population control. Eventually, a team of doctors was sent to Nazino Island to assess the situation. They were horrified by what they found: hundreds of emaciated prisoners, many of whom were on the brink of death. The doctors immediately called for help, but it was too late for many of the prisoners. In the end, it is estimated that as many as 4,000 of the 6,000 prisoners who were sent to Nazino Island died there. The survivors were eventually relocated to other areas, but the trauma of their experiences stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The Nazino Tragedy is a chilling reminder of the dangers of totalitarianism and the horrors that can be inflicted upon innocent people in the name of political ideology. It serves as a warning to us all to remain vigilant against the abuses of power and to fight for the rights and freedoms of all people, no matter their background or beliefs.